All right. And it is 1 p.m. Central European time, and very delighted. Good afternoon to those in Europe and in Africa. Good morning to those who are starting their days in the Americas, and good evening to those joining us from Asia Pacific. We're glad that you could be with us today. Delighted to have another Thursday. We have been screening and hosting rather the webinars on the Global Compact for Migration, usually taking place on a Tuesday, but we have had to adjust with availability of panelists and moderators as well, given the trying times. I think that we ended the last webinar, the Global Compact for Migration 21, on returns and reintegration. And what a moment we have seen since then. That was 2 weeks ago. And now we're about day 13 into the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. So, and we can see that the crisis in Ukraine is very dire. A big hand to those who are involved in many ways, because we know that as migration professionals, some of you are involved in the work, whether in your own governments, or whether you're working in civil society, or whether you're working in advocacy around the different issues that have come out. I feel like we would have to have the opportunity for us to dive into returns again in a different way, because even as we were talking about it the other week, we have seen a very different picture that has happened unfolding for migrants that have been stranded in Ukraine, and particularly also talking about international students, thousands of international students that were stuck in some of the red zones, and some that remain stuck. So we hold those that are still sitting in Ukraine and in other parts of the world. Indeed, somebody did remind me that are waiting for a safe passage to return home, that are waiting for situations that have not changed, or situations that are desirable for their personal decisions to return. So I think we ended on a very high and sober note last week, and I think we have really been humbled by some of the events that are unfolding in different parts of the world. But I thought it's important for us to recognize the fact that we are, we know we're aware in the migration community of what is happening in Ukraine. So zooming into where we are today, we have gone through 21 objectives. Like I said, the last one on returns, but since the day that we started in September, we have had the opportunity to have various experts from all corners of the globe. I don't think we have left any corner untouched, but indeed, we haven't heard from enough voices on the various topics. So today, we are delighted that we have an opportunity for us to dive into Global Compact for Migration, objective number 22 on social protection. And the text read, we commit to assist migrant workers at all skills levels to have access to social protection in countries of destination, and to profit from the portability of applicable social security entitlements and earned benefits in their countries of origin, or when they decide to take up work in another country. And, you know, throughout the series of the Global Compact for Migration, but also thinking about the various partners that are here that engage in something we call the People's Migration Challenge, we have touched on the issues that are related to earned benefits and social security entitlements for migrants, and particularly trying to understand the portability of them. And today we have an able panel, but before I do that, let me just recognize the 4 organizations that are behind this Global Compact for Migration webinar series, which is the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, CCRM, the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, GRFDT, the International Institute for Migration and Development, IIMAD, Asia, the Metropolis Asia Pacific, and the Migrant Forum in Asia. And I am your moderator. My name is Patty Sianga Knudsen, and I'm one of the vice presidents at GRFDT. delighted that friends of the various organizations, delighted that students who are joining this as part of a certificate program are here to hear from a very able and excellent panel on this particular topic, where we're looking at the commitment to establish mechanism for the portability of Social Security entitlements and earned benefits. I'm delighted to welcome Ellen Sana, who's the Executive Director for the Center for Migrant Advocacy in the Philippines, Dr. Kennedy Achacomo, who is a labor economist and also the principal at the Ghana Labor College of Trades Union Congress, and Mr. Lachman Basnet, a very familiar face as Ms. Elaine is, but also, you know, second time we have Dr. Kennedy join us. Mr. Lachman Basnet is the General Secretary of the South Asian Regional Trade Union Council. And to start off, let me put on to our stage here, because we really want to go straight into it. Miss Elaine, Madam Elaine Sana is from the Center for Migrant Advocacy, and she is the Executive Director. It's a Philippine-based non-governmental organization that works for the rights and welfare of Philippine migrant workers and their families, predominantly working on advocacy, facilitating assistance to distressed migrants, as well as providing different types of support, including information. And her areas of work in this particular space is really lobbying, and both at the local, at various levels, at the local, at the national, and at the regional level, as well as the international forums. And she has also been, supporting the work on training and capacity building on migrants' rights. And she is also the principal resource person at the CMA. I think it's also important for us to note other spaces in which Elaine is active in. So the migrant labor representative for the National Tripartite Industrial Peace Council, which was in the Philippines up until last year. And she's also a permanent member of the Migrant Labor Representative that looks at decent work. That's the advisory committee. She's the secretary for the Philippines Migrants' Rights Watch. And she's also the CSO reference group for Philippines program for the Safe and Fair project of the women's migrants workers implemented by UN and ILO. And I thought it's very important to point those out, because I think, Elaine, you have this great connection, I would say, across different platforms, across different actors. We're talking international, national, and the regional space, but also a very deeply and grounded roots with the migrants, providing and interacting with them in the different arenas that you work with, but particularly as the executive director at CMA. So the question that we thought you could kind of unpack for us here is trying to understand the exclusion of many migrant workers in the so-called low-waged occupation. How is that affecting women migrants disproportionately in terms of social protection and the social security programs that are there in these countries of destination? And of course, it's International Women's Day 2 days ago, and I think it's a right time for us to put you on the stage, but also to hear a bit more strongly around these issues that voice out the concern of women as migrants. Over to you, Elaine.
Thank you, Paddy, and I echo your greetings in the observance of the International Women's Day. And to be consistent with the occasion, let me start off with a personal story. The personal is political. This year, I turned 60 years old, and immediately we have a law here that provides entitlement to senior citizens. So 20% discount to in hospitals, in transportation, food, medicine, and if it's a public hospital, you get free treatment and all that. On top of that, at the office, we also have a supplemental medical card, So that would probably give you idea, you have a system there that, when you get sick, you will be good. For the first time also, a year ago, I started to take medicines, maintenance medicines for diabetes and for my blood pressure. And this will be for like lifetime maintenance, so a regular expense, I should say. And for the first time, 2 weeks ago or so, I had to go to the hospital for a series of tests, including mammogram. And my bill was $300 equivalent. But then I utilized my medical card, I utilized my senior card, but in the end, I still had to pay like $72. So you can imagine that I would say I am more privileged than many others because I'm still able to go to the hospital and do the test and be able to pay. But you can imagine that for many of our migrant workers, this is not a very easy thing to do. And as you said, especially for our women migrant workers who are disproportionately concentrated in domestic work, which is of course characterized by low wage, low salaries, and also bordering on informality and precarity. So going to the issue of social protection, if you go to the UN documents, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, Article 22 and 25, says something about social protection and social security as the basic human right of everyone. So it's not on the basis of citizenship or legal status or what have you. But then we know for a fact that especially for workers who cross the borders, this is not really observed. And as you correctly said, and this is supported by evidence, especially excluded are the domestic workers, migrant domestic workers, and those in similar situation where they get low wages and also bordering on informality and precarity. And this is quite really the situation after so many years already of advocating for the rights of migrant workers, trying to exert effort to mainstream the issue of migrant workers, that they are entitled to decent work conditions just like any other workers. And this is especially highlighted in these times of the pandemic, when so many millions have been displaced, have lost their jobs, have gotten sick, have been stranded. And when we speak of social protection and social security, we are not only talking of like when you reach 60 onwards, you're talking of the here and now as you talk of the future. When you start to get sick more often than not, you start to get the maintenance medicine and all that. And so I think this is something that the pandemic has brought to the fore, has been highlighted. And definitely, it's a good opportunity that we are discussing the objectives of the GCM. Very good, I was able to catch up with with objective 22, which is very, very important. Like in the case of Filipino migrant workers, in 3 years' time, the overseas employment program will be 50 years. So we've been having overseas employment for 50 years. And many of those who've started it are already have been retired. But then for many of them who retired ahead of the others, they have not been able to get that social security, even that social protection that is very much needed, especially as they go into retirement. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that the commitment of the member states of the UN is to facilitate access of everyone, of all migrant workers across job occupation. And I think we must emphasize that those who have less, I mean, wages and other things, should have more in terms of social protection, because that's the only way you can offset this very, very big imbalance, this very, very wide wedge between the so-called the highly skilled who are really very much taken care of, and then those who are low, the so-called low skilled and low wage, which are just as needed as the highly skilled workers. So this pandemic has highlighted the urgency of not overlooking this very, very important component of decent work, which is social protection and social security, and at the same time, of course, especially in public emergency, safety nets that should be inclusive of everyone. It cannot be, okay, are you documented? Are you not documented? Which occupation are you in? That is not the case here. And I think we should appreciate the importance of social protection, objective 22, not objective 24. There's no objective 24, but I think it's definitely very, very important. Portability is another. Yeah, and again, many countries and origin, destination, whatever you call it, because origin countries, Philippines, we also host a lot of migrant workers now, and increasingly for that matter. And it's not like, oh, they are entitled automatically to social protection or social security. So what we are saying is that there are many ways to guarantee social protection. Inclusion of provisions in the employment contract. We have been doing that, but again, during times of emergencies, employers would not honor them. So these are issues that are already being applied or being implemented, but all the more during public emergencies that they should be complied with and observed, particularly by employers. There is no excuse that because of the crisis, they will just forget their responsibilities. Of course, there's the more formal arrangement for social security enrollment. And what we have, for example, in the case of the Philippines, cognizant of the absence of social security programs in countries of destination where we deploy a lot, like in the Gulf, because what they have there is the end of service benefits. The Philippine government extended the social security program. It's a good initiative, but it cannot be one for the long term, because in the way it's implemented for migrant workers, only the migrant worker pays for the contribution, when it is supposed to be a solidarity contribution of the employer and the worker, and then the state stepping in to make sure that they enjoy the benefits of the social protection. So I think we've had some similar discussions on this, and while it is a commendable effort on the part of government to extend social protection, social security unilaterally to Filipinos overseas, it is not something sustainable. And I think in the case of the Philippines, for 50 years is very long time enough to unpack or maybe think out of the box on how we can make sure that all workers across borders, within borders, have equal access to social protection and portability as well. So if they need to reform the law, then they need to reform the law. Maybe they can make arrangements for administrative arrangements, and this has been done by several countries already. So I think this is not something that is impossible to do. Some have started to do it. So I think, but this is especially challenging in Asia, because there are very few countries here that that include all migrant workers in their social security and social protection programs. And I think this is the challenge that we have to also include and on board in our advocacy and making use of the opportunities offered by the GCM. So maybe I stop there for now, Paddy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elaine, for highlighting quite a number of issues, and I think starting us off on this mode where you've essentially, I think, when we look at the GCM text, for instance, even though, in this setting, sometimes what we would like is to hear around the GCM objective, though, and then kind of have that local element, or what is the real element, feedback into the GCM. Some of the options that you've talked about are things that have been kind of, proposed to member states to take up. The ratification, like you have said, of relevant conventions, but also kind of, legal frameworks being revised, because indeed nothing is cast in stone. Even constitutions have had the opportunity to be changed. It takes time, it takes a lot of effort, but then, it's also about the intent and ensuring that migrants are catered for in this particular case. I just wanted to come back maybe with a question to you. I mean, you talked about some of the countries. I mean, you've given some highlights. I wonder, from your experience, also from from the Asian side. I know we'll hear more also from Mr. Basnet, but to try and understand, when we look at the best practices that are around, what kind of, what would portability look like? What would portability look like when we're talking about migrants moving their social benefits? What does that actually look like? Because it seems as though in some arrangements, for instance, in the European Union, that kind of movement seems to be much able. If somebody is moving, for instance, from a global north country, so if you're moving from the United Kingdom to a country in the global south, there are a lot of restrictions that sort of come in portability. You are almost, as a senior person, you are almost required to stay in the land that you have been employed in for you to enjoy those kind of benefits, or you lose some of them in one way or another. And you've just said, one of the things we should be doing when, at this senior beautiful age, is to be able to enjoy some of these benefits of the very hard work. So, and that's usually you want to do, for instance, in the company of your family. But that portability aspect, I think, for some countries has been quite difficult, and has forced migrants then to stay in a particular space. But also in the case of COVID, as we saw from the Middle East, predominantly from the Middle East, that migrants who left wages and benefits behind, and then they are being told, probably you have to come back and to be able to deal with these things, and there are all sorts of things. So any kind of reflections around some of the real kind of examples that we have on ground on portability, and what you can see as sort of best practices?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Paddy, for highlighting the importance of portability of social protection or social security benefits. It's just like the migrants who are mobile, or they move. So the protection should also be able to move where the migrants are, and not keep them because the law says that you have to stay in that country. But I think, reflecting on this situation in Asia, for example, when we were doing advocacies a few years back to forge social security agreement in Korea, because we have workers in Korea. What was interesting, and we are already like in the process of, the Social Security Office in Manila was having negotiations or talks already with their counterparts in Korea. When they conducted the consultations among migrants in Korea, they did not like the idea. They did not like the idea of the Social Security agreement that would also affect portability of benefits from Korea to Philippines when the migrant is already back in the country. So we were wondering, what is the explanation for that? The explanation was the migrants prefer one lump sum payment, because that is, once they get it, then they are rest assured that they are getting it. Because I don't think, maybe they don't trust the system will provide them the monthly pension. That is supposed to be the intention of the Social Security agreement. And I think this is probably in the case of many Asian countries. And again, short, maybe you say what is being offered in the Middle East. It's called end of service benefits, gratuity, depending on how long you work. But this is totalized, no? So you transfer from one office to another, but for as long as you are like in one country, they compute that. And then supposedly, under normal times, when you resign from your work, then you get your end of service benefits, and that's one lump sum. So somehow this issue of legal systems that will allow transmittal of money from one country to another is not very much surface in the context of Asia, because the normal idea of social protection for pension purposes, for retirement, is the lump sum end of service benefits. But again, the thing is, maybe end of service benefit is different from the social protection and social security that the ILO intends for all of us, for the workers especially. So I think even if the ESB is in fact being extended to domestic workers now in many of the Gulf states, it may be not, cannot approximate the social protection and social insurance that we are supposed to benefit from the Convention on Social Security, where there is shared contribution between the workers and the employers. No, so again, that remains to be a challenge. But for example, one very good development in Asia is the one with Japan, because Japan forged social security agreement with several countries, including the Philippines, and they in fact revised their requirements. You know, instead of like 25 years, you can get your benefits for if you stay for 10 years. If below 10 years, then you are not qualified for the regular pension, but then you can get the lump sum equivalent of the amount that you paid. So that is something, but that's only like Japan. So what we're trying to have is, for example, in the ASEAN, they've been trying to work out together how to harmonize the social security program, but I'm not sure how close it is to see a regional arrangement on the portability of social security benefits. But what is interesting is, like in the case of the Philippines, we have situations of totalization of benefits. So a worker started paying in the Philippines, and then the worker goes to another country. Well, this is Europe. So they go to Europe, like in Spain, and then their contribution here is totalized in Spain. So it's not like wasted, but it is added on, and then they get it back under, I think we have a social security agreement with Spain. We have actually several arrangements with the countries in Europe. So where there is no barrier to securing the pension, even if they are already back in the Philippines, but not for all countries. So the good thing, we have administrative arrangements with the Netherlands, and very recently, Italy, they started to have. We've been forging a social security agreement with Italy for like 20 years. But of course, social security agreement is something that is mutual. You know, like Filipinos in Italy benefiting while back in the country, and the Italians in the Philippines. No, and maybe the Italians realize that, oh, there is imbalance in the number of the beneficiaries of Filipinos and the Italians. And so they pulled out of the negotiations. But recent development had this, there is a group here in the Philippines that set up a patronato, that the idea, the purpose of which is to facilitate, to assist Filipinos who work many years in Italy and are now back in the Philippines on how they can avail of their social security contributions while back in the Philippines. So I think there is hope. Again, as I said, while we are trying to push for a new idea of including migrant workers, regardless of occupation, and more so the low-wage migrant workers, inclusion of social security benefits in the contract is something that is beneficial, that would be good. Also, tapping on the deposits. Usually employers in countries of destination, like in the Gulf, are expected to put an escrow money. And so if the worker is about to leave, and usually employers will not have the interest unless they are pressured to really like pay up, then they can use probably that funds to pay off the what is due to the workers. So I think there are many routes to it. It's just that countries of destination, member states should be able to recognize that as part of their obligation, and that they should be ready to invest in social protection that will cover all of us, immigrant workers in particular.
Glenn, thank you very much for shedding light on the importance of sort of the mutuality of these agreements. And I think also the fact that you know that we're not out of examples that we could pick from. I think it's been very interesting to hear some of the reflections you've shared out of Europe, but also in the ASEAN region, but also just looking at Asia itself, and understanding you know what could come out and what potentially could be sort of pools of funds that could be put in the case of migrant workers who are leaving, and so that you know companies and institutions are not out of funds when that person is ready to end the service with them. But I think you've shed a lot of light. We will come back to you, and one of the questions I think that would be important for us to get a sense of is the role of countries of origin, because it seems as though the GCM puts a lot of onus, obviously talks about the mutual, but there's a lot on what the country of destination should be doing, and rightly so. But we're wondering, in this day and age where we know that countries of origin have agency, migrants have agency themselves, what more can we see from the countries of origin? And maybe, you know, just reflecting in on this, but thank you so much for having shared your reflections, and we will come back to you in a moment. And we stay in South Asia, and in South Asia, we would like to welcome Mr. Lachman Basnet, who will talk to us. I mean, around kind of the importance of social security from his perspective, but also touch on, you know, social security funds, and give us a bit of, you know, an enlightenment of that in relation to conventions in the ILO, as well as sort of talking about some of what we see as social security products. And then there are a couple of other spaces I think that Mr. Lachman will touch on. But before he comes on, I think it's important that we give an introduction. Mr. Lachman Basnet is the General Secretary of the South Asian Regional Trade Union Council, and he formally started his political career as an activist for the Nepali Congress in 1967, joining the trade union movement after the reestablishment of the Nepali Trade Union Congress in 1990 as its president until 2013. He has been a member of the ICFTU AP and the ITU, so the International Trade Union Congress, since 1992, and he's also a member of the ILO governing body. He was a member of the ILO governing body from 1997 to 2009, and currently he's also the General Convention delegate of the Nepali Congress Party. Mr. Lachman, you are welcome to share with us your reflections.
Thank you, Patty. It's a great honor for me to be here and in a very august meeting, and a little nervous too, but I think I can face it. And thank you very much for inviting me. And Social Security is my favorite point of issue for the migrant workers and the general workers. So, what is Social Security for me? It's in Nepal, it's a part of your payroll. It's part of the payroll. If you go into the market, you don't get the whole amount of money, but certain money you get as a pension. So I don't think it's a gratitude from the employer or the government. It is the part of your salary. Now, when I was in trade union, I used to negotiate for the end of service. Then the companies used to say that, okay, I'm broke, I cannot pay. So I thought they should be paying every month for the social protection system for the workers. So we started this campaign for social protection 26 years ago. And we said that Provident Fund is 10%, 8% gratuity, that's 1 month's salary, 8.33% is 1 month's salary, 18.33%, and 1.67% is for your medical benefits. That employer owes you, he should pay you. And that is the salary structure in Nepal. And the workers has to pay 10% for Social Security Fund. So altogether, it's a 30% is deposited. I went to the government and told the government that, look, let's introduce this social security process into the migrant workers, and the 30% salary we bring directly to Nepal, have an agreement with the country of destination and bring it Nepal and keep it as a social protection for them. And our money is fluctuating all the time. So that let's put that money into the workers' account in hard currency. Then when they retire, we give it to them. In the future, price of the dollar or whatever the hard currency they earn. So let's do that. So that comes to a huge amount, and that will be a very good poverty reduction program. That's how we started social protection for the migrant workers. And in 2014, there was a SARC convention in Nepal, and we said that two agenda we put forward. One is Agenda 20, that is acknowledge the social needs of the early women, children, differently able person, unemployed person, and persons working in hazardous sites, and agree to develop a strengthened social protection for them to share the best practices in this regard. That's the social protection for the whole region. And other one is the migration region. And we have completed that. It was adopted by the SARC, but after the 2014, it did not, it could not materialize. But what we are saying, that social protection is a must for migrant workers in GCC countries. Now, it's not that even today, there are certain class of workers in GCC countries get the social protection, and it's portable. When they leave their job in the GCC countries, they bring that end of service money to back home. Like Alan said, in Korea, the Korean Nepalese worker going to Korea, they get their social protection at home. When they come back home, they get their social protection money here. Or they can keep it there if they go back again. So end of the service, they get the whole lump sum money. With the Britain, in Second World War, those who went to fight in battle, they are still getting pension scheme in our hill region. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of British Army, those are Gorkha Army, they are getting it in Nepal. And even in India, from Indian services, when they retire, the social protection is sent back here. There is a big camp here, Indian Retirement Army Camp. And they distribute social protection every now and then. I don't know exactly in what interval they say. So social protection is a compulsory mechanism which is followed in Nepal through negotiation between two governments, and it is portable. This is what we are saying, that we have to give this chance to social security. But in GCC countries, there is a catch. The catch is, until and unless all the regional countries accept the social protection, it cannot be applied, because some of the countries, suppose country A stresses upon social protection with the GCC countries, and country B doesn't stress upon social protection with the GCC countries. So country B's workers will be cheaper in in GCC countries. So they will opt for the country B's workers, not country A. So what we decided in 2014, that all the 6 countries of South Asia should adopt this. Then we try to bring that case to Colombo process in various meetings. Then we try to convince our government that you push Once this time in 2018 till now, Nepal was chair of the Colombo process. We asked our government to push this, to put this agenda into Abu Dhabi dialogue discussion, that social protection should be included. But unfortunately, it has failed. It has failed. So now again, the Pakistan is the chair of, we will try that all these GCC countries, country of origin and country of destination, should ratify social protection for both the countries. Paddy, you cannot imagine, like Alan said, it's a little bit of a condition of the workers, those who come back from GCC countries, or even in any other country. I don't want to single out any country, but all the countries. Some of the workers come very in a wretched condition unless we give them social protection. They come physically handicapped, they come mentally sick, they come all kinds of disease and all these things. I mean, I'm forgetting about the able-bodied. Able-bodies also need social protection when they come back. But more than that, they are physically and mentally handicapped. And somebody has to look after them. So we need social protection in this, and we are still pushing for social portability of the social protection. Portability of the social protection is only acceptable if country of origin and country of destination both agree. But not one single country can agree with the other. Now, Malaysia has said, okay, we will give social protection to Nepali workers. But Malaysia is not member of this group in Abu Dhabi dialogue, but they are associate member there. But they can make their own decision. So what I'm trying to tell you is it cannot be implemented until everybody accepts it. This is my feeling. Thank you.
I think that's absolutely right, and it feels, for lack of a better word, a bit of a hostage situation, isn't it, Mr. Lachman? That the fact that if one country doesn't sign, the others don't, but then actually the migrants' welfare is what is being impacted, and the negotiating power then of the sending countries becomes absolutely. I mean, they feel, I mean, we cannot say, I think powerless is not a word that I would like to use, but, you know, they feel that the negotiating power there is limited. And I wanted to just come back with a question. In the event that we have, you know, sending countries that seem to be very vibrant, as you have explained from your side, and even migrant workers that I think are working on the ground with various civil society organizations, you know, trying to raise awareness around these issues. So it's not an issue that people are not aware, with best practices that are available from the region, but also just looking into Europe and seeing how portability has been able to work, but also the fact that social protection is guaranteed by you carrying an EU, you know, your digital EU health card. You are able to be treated across several countries, you know, knowing that these things are evident elsewhere, but that bargaining power on the negotiating table still seems to be tilted. What do you think is the role then of, for instance, the International Trade Union Congress, and also for international organizations such as the International Labour Organization and others that are involved in looking at the welfare of migrant workers and indeed their families?
So the problem with the migrant workers is they do not have the right to vote at home turf. They do not have the right to vote. What I am asking to my government is we have to give them a right to vote in the country. Any place, in one place, which is very easy for you to accept. Then the whole scenario will change in one country. The people from one country will ask that, okay, we are voting for you. We are facing this. These are the problems. Please do a better negotiating with the counterpart. They do the very good negotiating with their counterpart. So, I mean, ITUC is also supporting us in this. But I think the time is not right at present. That the other thing is that the job condition is shrinking. Job condition is shrinking in around the world, or even in GCC countries. That nobody wants to lose people. Sending to migrant as a migrant worker, they don't want to reduce the number of migrant workers. So, sort of a slow movement going on there. That is the problem. So, what we are saying in trying to introduce this thing to our next president in that the social protection should be included here. So it should come into the dialogue between Abu Dhabi dialogue. It should come into the dialogue. I don't think the GCC countries or Abu Dhabi dialogue countries will object to it. But the country of origin should come to one point that, okay, we should demand social protection for our workers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is also something, how do the countries in the region with a common countries of destination also hold together? I think we have heard also in the confines of this discussions as well, how when we talked about fair recruitment, the fact that if one country is able to offer migrant workers at a much more disadvantaged point in terms of the rights that the migrant workers gets, that makes it difficult for another country with the same type of labor supply to be able to negotiate better packages. So yes. I think that also speaks to sending countries, to what's our limit to what we can actually take, and how do we set the golden standard for ourselves at that negotiating table.
So what we were asking is that for one kind of job around the region, the skill harmonization in the should be there. And suppose one position should have a similar pay scale around for either it is from country A or country B. There should not be any differences. Then only we can have a very harmonious relationship with each other. But otherwise, we will be competing each other. So there won't be any negotiation. So it's not my opinion. It's the ILO in 2004 had several meetings of the region, and we agreed that the scale should be harmonized, and the pay scale for one position, one scale. One position, one scale. Suppose one level of worker goes from any country, he should have a standard contract. Once the standard contract idea is applied, then recruitment will be all right. There won't be any. False sending people. In the false pretext, nobody can send people. One idea that, okay, for any country, that one position, one pay scale, and standard contract. In standard contract, it should be written that who pays what. What are the obligations of the employer? What are the obligations of the country of origin? And what is the obligation of country of workers of the origin country?
Absolutely. Mr. Lachman, thank you very much for bringing in these very important reflections. I think talking about coordination, that's really necessary from the sending countries themselves. So, how do we have we may not have the same views, but how do we have a uniform voice when we, at the negotiating table with countries of destination? But I think, one of the things that we'll bring back to you a little bit later is to talk about the role of other actors into this conversation as well. I mean, really talking, I think it would be good to kind of hear how, for instance, private sector engages in this, but also how this becomes a migrants' rights focused mission. So really looking at the plight, like you had said before, migrant workers are returning from countries where they have been working very hard and coming back with health conditions, coming back into a situation where they have even no access when they have returned home, and often without having a portability of their benefits as well. So really thinking ahead in terms of these migrant workers, both when they are social protection needs in the space where they are, but also what the portability would be like. But thanks again for joining us. And we will move to Africa. And just to see Mr. Kennedy we were having, okay,
Hello.
now I can see you. There you are, I can see you. I think, okay, yes, you are welcome. So, moving on to Africa, where I think it will be important for us to also just understand social protection, understand portability of social benefits. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. Kennedy Atong Achakoma, who is the Director of Education and Training and the Principal of the Ghana Labour College of Trades Union Congress. And he is also a lecturer at the School of Development Studies of the University of Cape Coast. He has been working in the area of trade union, doing a lot of trade union work for the last 15 years in research, in advocacy, and also in capacity building, covering various issues, including social protection. He's a labor activist and a founder member of the International Trade Union Confederation Africa, which is the Africa Trades Union Migration Network. And he's also serving on the Ghana's National Platform on Migration and the Technical Working Group on National Labor Migration. And he has he's published quite widely. He's an economist, and he holds a PhD in migration studies, which is a collaborative degree between the University of Ghana and the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, Netherlands. Dr. Kennedy, we are glad that you're able to join us, and we just wanted to take a moment and zoom into, we have been in Asia and trying to understand what the issues are like in terms of portability of social benefits, but also looking at what social protection has looked like. Some examples I think that we can see on the African continent. We know, for instance, that data out there is now demystifying what was known as a lot of migration out of Africa into other parts, and yet we know that there's a lot of intra and inter-regional migration within the African continent itself. But then also at the same time, we know that there are many migrants that leave for other destinations, to Europe, the Americas, and many other parts, including Asia Pacific. And just to have an understanding, what does social protection then for migrants who are, in urban centers, working in various sectors, whether formal or informal, what does social protection look like for migrants and workers in Africa? And also, where would you say that social protection really, where does it really start from? And also, I think one of the things we would like to get an understanding of is this portability of social benefits. Over to you, the floor is yours.
Let me say good afternoon from Accra, Ghana, to my comrades and other participants in this important program. Let me underscore the human rights aspect of social security as enshrined in several international instruments. My colleagues have highlighted those instruments, whether the ILO instruments, the UN instruments, particularly Agenda 2020 is the heartbeat. Social security or social protection is the heartbeat of Agenda 2030. Social security or social protection broadly in Africa is not good by the scope, because there have been efforts to make sure the low coverage and exclusion of some aspects of workers are brought to bear in that framework. I would want to take the argument to the aspect of the generality of workers, where migrants are part of workers, which part of Africa that we might be talking of. So the low coverage itself for workers and the exclusion of some sections from national legislations in terms of social security is one of the challenges to the access. So we are talking about two components here, the access to social security, and then you can then talk of portability. If you don't have access to it, there's nothing you can talk about in terms of portability. So for migrants, we are even looking at the African region. Across all countries, we have challenges with our laws that must be inclusive so that everybody can be brought on board in terms of social protection. There are cases of protection in terms of maternity, unemployment insurance, sickness, disease, and others. But if you are looking at the national schemes where you have long-term benefits, where eligibility is about several years of contribution before you go voluntary or involuntary, which has to take a number of months. Like in Ghana, we have 180 months minimum to get retirement in terms of the long-term benefits, invalidity, survivor's benefit, and the retirement old age benefit. That is so huge. But how can we look at schemes that are inclusive? The low-hanging schemes, innovative schemes are tied to the national scheme so that we can pass that as a window of entry. So if you look at the case of Ghana, where we had to reform the existing law, and the new Act 766 has brought about 3 tiers. We have the first two, the mandatory. One is privately managed as compared to the first year. I mean, unlike the first year, which remains with the Social Security Fund. And then the voluntary, which includes informal sector economic operators, where migrants dominate. This is an innovation that we can bring to bear so that migrants can pass through that window as a beginning before we can talk of the national systems. Of course, if you look at, there are several agreements in the continent. If you look at the case of Spain and Morocco, as far as 2005, the agreement between them, they are specified that it must cover workers that are under the legislation of national frameworks. So, of course, the problem begins from home. So if you look at that arrangement, they are telling you that the workers that want to enter agreement with us, with Spain, that is the case of Morocco, they must have been covered by your national legislation. This is an important point if you are talking of bilateral arrangements. They will put those conditions on you. So the onus lies on Africans to make sure that within the region or within the individual countries, we have access to social security for all workers, including migrant workers, whether they are temporary or seasonal migrants, domestic migrant workers, or whatever you are talking about. Of course, as I talk about the arrangements in Africa, we have the SADC community part of that have the cross-border portability arrangements, with about 15 countries included. We also have the case of ECOWAS convention, which was adopted in 2013, Social Security Convention. There are others in the East African bloc. So if you put this together and there's that political will to make things work, then you can see the kind of success that we have achieved. And then beyond that, we can then look at economic blocs having arrangements with other economic blocs, like the SADC region having an arrangement with the ECOWAS region and that of East African bloc. That would have been a huge success for Africa. And then before we extend it to talking about migrants to the GCC countries, migrants from Africa to Europe. And of course, let's not forget the fact that a large chunk of the migration of Africans is within Africa. And therefore, if we are talking about social security arrangement, it should be within the blocks I've mentioned, and then also extending inter and intra blocks. Of course, let me say that we must not forget the obstacles to access to social security, lack of information, and of course, I've highlighted the exclusion of some sectors, particularly the informal sector, from national social security legislations, where the migrants are dominated. And of course, you can't talk about access to social security when these legislations are not reformed. How do we get the frameworks within the various blocks to work? Since 2030, the ECOWAS Convention on Social Security has been rolled out through the Free Movement and Migration Project. But we still have coordination commitments. We still have the political will of national governments to reform their systems and begin to have bilateral arrangements between countries. Like the case of the SADC, where you have that arrangement between the Republic of South Africa and that of Zimbabwe. But of course, there are challenges as to issues of equality of treatment. The nationals themselves do not even see the need for that. And some of the institutions do not see the need for that equality of treatment. Of course, there are provisions in terms of portability, but the equality of treatment is also important and very key in those arrangements. So there are a number of components, even within the arrangements, that we need to look at and make sure that the administrative arrangements are working. And of course, if you talk about portability, it's not just about the movement, but making sure the rights acquired and the processes to those rights are preserved. And of course, making sure that administrative arrangements and processes work to facilitate easy access and portability. We are not saying that if a migrant moves from Tunisia to Morocco or Morocco to France, within a month, the person should be able to go with the social security investment. But of course, the person must see that there are processes that are there and are working to facilitate that. We are also talking about even if the migrant leaves, what of the left behind, the family members? Are there national arrangements catering for the migrant's family? Those are systems that can also motivate the migrant to return and reintegrate smoothly. So in that aspect, we need to actually look at what are the gaps and how can we work collectively within our national jurisdictions, within the African continent, where we have the control of our systems. And then if these systems are strengthened and extended to cover majority of the workers, including migrants, then we can have the political will and of course the buy-in by other regions like the Gulf regions, the European states, and even if we have to have arrangements with Asia. And you can see that in the Asian region, like the Philippines are having arrangements with Qatar and other countries in the Gulf. They have put in the domestic systems and they are working. And therefore, those countries are comfortable to easily go in and have MOUs or bilateral labor agreements where there are social security clauses included. Of course, we have had a situation of drumming home the need to make sure that civil society and labor unions are involved in bilateral labor arrangements. So that if you don't have social security arrangements specifically, then clauses regarding that can be included in those arrangements. These are some of the things we must be working and actually sitting up and making sure that the advocacy, awareness creation, and sensitization is there, and of course, lobbying our governments to make sure that the frameworks they have adopted and signed, be it the ECOWAS Convention, be it the SADC community, cross-border portability, social security arrangements, be it the East African bloc, and collectively would have imagined that the whole of Africa would have been perfect. If you think of the SADC, it's about 15 countries. If you think of ECOWAS, it's about 15 countries. The East African bloc is about 5 or 6 others willing to join. That would have been the whole of Africa. And then we can have across regions. These are some of the things we need to do, else we'll talk and come back and the same thing will be staring at us. And migrants, not only migrants, but of course, workers would not have access to social protections. At least we're looking at the basic flaws, the basic benefits to reduce poverty, to reduce the suffering of workers. Some of them are lacking in our countries. And we begin at that level. That is what we need to do in terms of social security arrangements, and then we can talk about portability. Access is the fundamental ingredient before portability. Thank you.
Dr. Kennedy, thank you. I think you have managed in very few minutes to also just, pour some cold water on our faces, I think, to take a step back in terms of access. And we may take for granted that that access to social security is a given, and yet that is actually the stepping point, and that is the starting point for anything, for access to, and that's very much linked, for instance, to identification, very much linked to regularization in a lot of different countries. And also linked to having some kind of an identity document also on you. So we can see how other aspects of the GCM also have a bearing on this particular objective. You've talked about the importance of information as well. When migrants are not aware, but actually also when authorities are not fully aware of what it means to value migrants. You talked about the importance there also of elimination of institutional discrimination, in sort of thinking that why would migrants need social protection, or why would they need social security? And also the importance of the inclusion of all migrants, including their families, in these particular frameworks, and the importance of starting at home. How do we start at home so that even before we engage, we have all the right tools for the journey? The concept of leaving no one behind remains absolutely necessary, the informal sector. And I just thought, could we just, for a minute or so before we move to the Q&A, when we look in, you talked about, for instance, the agreement with Spain and Morocco, where the recognition, it falls under the legislation of the country of origin. And when we think about, destinations such as the Gulf, where a lot of young women, and because we are exporting a lot of domestic workers that actually even back at home are not recognized as domestic workers. In some legislations, they're called day workers, and so on. How that actually also impacts a lot on what's happening to migrants and the kind of protection that they provide. So that's one part of the question. And then the other part is sort of to understand access to social protection, and maybe some examples that you have seen from your work. Now, particularly talking about social protection in the context of COVID, services, COVID packages that were being given to citizens. How, in your assessment of what you look at on the continent, how has access to social protection looked like on the continent during COVID?
Thank you very much. I think across the region, COVID took the countries by storm. Even the well-endowed economies had difficulties. But of course, across the region, there were several initiatives by governments to bring some relief in terms of social cushioning the citizens. right here in Ghana, we had samples of initiatives where, in terms of access to water and access to electricity energy, was heavily subsidized for all citizens, including those we call migrants. Water was virtually free. And of course, they went further to have packages in terms of sustaining their businesses by having some financial assistance that were coordinated by the state institution. Of course, you can understand the challenges that migrants would have to face to assess those, because you would have to provide national identification. You know that in Ghana, that is a key document that's needed. Of course, from the trade union side, the union in the informal economy was able to organize some members to have access to that fund to sustain their businesses. Let me say that that particular union itself is having what we call the People's Pension Trust. This is a pension scheme by the association, Union of Informal Workers Association, samplings of what is in India. This scheme is positioned under the voluntary tier, which is a third aspect of the national pension scheme as a result of the reforms. And of course, largely for informal, and of course for formal workers who want to voluntarily, apart from the two mandatory schemes, to contribute so that they can have decent retirement. And let me state that in this particular tier, every worker, including migrant workers, can contribute. Though the formal contributions is about 18.5%, which is divided among the two tiers. But of course, 13.5% and 5% and other deductions. But that particular decision is based on your ability. But at least, if you can contribute 14.5%, you can contribute to the voluntary third-tier scheme. And it has no restrictions for whichever worker would want to contribute. So this is an innovation within my country that you can say that yes, there are efforts to make sure that within the national scheme, there are windows for people to go through and have access to social security and other benefits. But of course, the laws allow for other social protection schemes like the National Social Insurance. All workers have access to it, whether you are going to the hospital for sickness or whatever have you. At the workplace, in terms of maternity, there's no discrimination in terms of who qualifies for maternity protection, and so other protections. There are arrangements to have unemployment insurance scheme established. This is as a result of the huge challenges we had from the COVID, where a lot of workers had to lose their jobs. Some, unfortunately, could not get back to employment. How can we get those workers retrained and supported in other ways to build their skills so that they can be employable again? So these are some arrangements. I know in other countries, there were those arrangements to cushion workers that were heavily affected by the COVID. And there were no restrictions to the issue of nationality, because it was a pandemic that has no respect of persons. And as an issue of solidarity, all workers were included in some of the initiatives across Africa.
Thank you. Thank you for highlighting that. And I think maybe you can come back to us in terms of this, the recognition of, a big pool of migrant workers that are leaving the continent, not recognized at home as having, I think a bit different from countries like the Philippines, where domestic workers have actually full recognition. And in a space like in Africa, where domestic work is sort of still seen as housework and has not been formalized as such, even in local legislation, how that impacts. But you can take that as a food for thought as we open the floor. I'll invite our panelists joining us back on the floor again in a moment, but the audience is welcome to share with us your questions, your reflections from the different spaces that you are in. I'm just going to have a look at the chat to see if we have questions that are coming through. Let's see. Thank you for some of the questions that are coming into the PM. That's also fine. That's okay. Anyone would like to raise their hand and share with us? Please feel free. Some questions, some reflections on today's topic, some clarifications from the geographical spaces. Maybe one of the questions that that has come up, and that is, I guess, that can also be addressed for both, Mr. Lachman, Elaine, and also Dr. Kennedy, is sort of in relation to the European Union migration pacts, right? There are these pacts that are under negotiation in different spaces. We know that the EU, for instance, in Asia as well, sometimes tackles one country at a time. But to try and understand what is the space in there in terms of the topic that we're talking about today. So in relation to the European Union and moving forward to seeing how the recognition of migrants remains critical, and the need for labor remains critical. You know, what is the center of social protection, but also social security, portability of social security benefits, and we can even start from access, as Dr. Kennedy has highlighted. Does anyone want to start with that one? Dr. Kennedy, do you want to start on the EU one?
Can you take that again?
Okay, so in the context of the European Union negotiating new pacts and new migration pacts, how do you see the social security benefits? You know, how should it be positioned? Social security benefits, portability, but also access to social protection within the European Union for migrants, in your case, from Africa.
Yeah, I think that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. As I indicated, we have had long-standing arrangements between some African countries. I cited the case of Spain and Morocco as far back as 2005. There's also been those arrangements with France, between France and Tunisia, as far back as 1965, with some reforms lately. Of course, that of France and Mauritius. These are just few of the many examples and arrangements that we can look at and make sure that we strengthen whatever bilateral labor agreements we are entering into. And of course, we may not be able to specifically have stand-alone social security arrangements, but within those labor arrangements, where we are talking of the rights of migrants to be observed and protected, and then other employment conditions observed for decent work, then we can have social security clauses in there. If you look at the case of France and that of Tunisia, and of course, Spain and Morocco, they would go in and tell you the specific category of workers. Of course, it might be exclusionary, but it's good to begin. And then you, as time goes on, you talk about reforms to include other sections of workers. Because if you compare the Spain and Morocco arrangement, of course, equally they have with Ecuador. You look at the Ecuador arrangement where it was more wider as compared to that of Morocco. But of course, it depends on your ability to negotiate. And one of my colleagues indicated that. And we have time again, I said, let civil society, let the unions with their expertise be involved so that the labor lens can be brought to bear in terms of having adequate protection in terms of what is needed for improved protection of migrants at the host countries, so that we can ensure that there's decent work. But of course, most of these arrangements are done without or with the low participation of the unions and key civil society stakeholders. And that is what we need to work on and make sure that it is inclusive in terms of the negotiations and adoption, so that it can be very, it is broad-based,
Yes.
and acceptable by all. But as
Absolutely.
I said, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are cases that we can adopt.
Thank you for that, and I think your point on appropriate participation to these negotiations absolutely improves the preparation, particularly for the sending countries. I see Ellen and Mr. Lachman have a hand up. Can I just get a question from Cecily, so that we can have Ellen and Mr. Lachman take some questions? Cecily?
Yes, thank you very much. This is a wonderful conversation, learning so much. And forgive me if you've already touched on this, my connection isn't great, but I was wondering about any sort of model funding structures that have worked or proven successful in the past, at least from the host country standpoint, tax structures or who is contributing to these social security networks and the like. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I think we can have all the panelists give us some reflections. There was some that were shared, but it's actually no harm in emphasizing it. Elaine, and then Mr. Lachman.
Okay. Thank you, Patty. And just to go back to the EU, well, I don't know much about the new migration pact in the EU, but we know that in the EU, we have the most number of social security agreements. Out of the 15 that we have, Philippines and another country, we have 12 from Europe. So we have for Austria, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK. Spain in particular, I mentioned this earlier in my earlier intervention, provides for totalization of contribution. For workers who started paying in the Philippines and then they moved to Spain, they can include the contributions from the Philippines to the one that they have in Spain. And the other one that would also be a good example, maybe in response to Cecily, is the one that we have with Belgium actually covers the seafarers on board Belgian flags. So which is, of course, not normal in social security agreements, because it usually covers only land-based workers. No, so, and of course we have, I already mentioned this also in the earlier intervention, we have it with Japan. Japan's program for social security is also good. As I mentioned, they revised, they shortened the period for the enjoyment of the social security or age-old pension to 10 years. And instead of the 25-year period, which is in the original law, no? And then I think Canada in general has a good social security program as well that is inclusive of the migrants, but I don't know the details yet, but that is something that a lot are also looking up to in terms of something like a modeling, no? In terms of extending social protection or access to social protection. The other thing is, yeah, I think the challenge, this is good, but not good enough, I think. Again, in the context of the migrants, like most of the biggest concentration of our migrants are in Asia, Southeast East Asia, and the Gulf states. And the profile of Filipinos, for example, in these countries, they are in the process because there is path to citizenship. It's open to citizenship. Then maybe they would opt to also be naturalized in those countries. So the context is different. So I think they would have more leeways in terms of securing for themselves social security and access to social security benefits because the system is made that way. But then I think the bigger challenge is for the many migrants, Filipino migrants included, who are in Asia. Whereas, as you've heard from me and from Brother Laxman also, that the most that is available in the Gulf is end of service benefits, which is not social security. It's not like age-old pension. Yeah, it's one-time lump sum depending on how long you work, and of course we also know that many cases do not get the end of service benefits, especially in these times of the pandemic. So it doesn't really like it doesn't equal to the social security that we know about, no, for the here and now and for the old age. Of course, the observation is, and I agree with Kennedy, Dr. Kennedy, that one issue as well that we have to be mindful about is the lack of information that of the migrant workers, especially those that are in the low-wage occupations. And again, the take-off perhaps is, oh, maybe I will not be qualified, because that's how they are programmed to think. In one conference we had, the countries of origin would even argue, for example, that, oh, you just have to provide this as an option. It is not like an automatic, because in the end, the domestic workers would suffer because they will have to pay social security contribution, and with the little earnings that they are getting, maybe they will not be happy to do that. But again, if you put it that way, that it becomes just just becomes a burden on one party, then it really becomes problematic. Which brings me to the other situation, like in the case of the Philippines, because you mentioned, Paddy, I have to think of how countries of origin also are looking at it. In the case of the Philippines, we actually have several social security programs or social protection programs mandated by government that are extended to Filipino migrant workers. The intention is very good for the here and now and when they retire, but then many migrant workers are not very happy to enroll themselves into this because it's just themselves paying the contribution. So that is the problem here. And then for the other things that are very much focused on migration, like we have the OWA Welfare Fund. Probably you've heard about the Overseas Workers Welfare Fund. They contribute since the time it was formed in the 1980s up to the present time. They have not increased the contribution, which is only $25. And then the worker is entitled to so many benefits, no? But not the one for Providence, no? Not the Provident Fund. But then it extends to their family members as well. So there is also this additional, that is the mandatory insurance, topping now, and this is something that we should be monitoring, topping on the private insurance companies. So again, privatizing social security, social protection programs, while it can solve the here and now. Again, the point is, this is not the way probably to go about it, but they should be included in existing social protection programs. But unfortunately, again, as I said, in many countries in Asia, it is they don't have that. So I think we have to be mindful what is available, grab it, make sure it is implemented and complied with, but then think out of the box. And this is something for origin countries and destination countries to discuss together. As Brother Laxman mentioned, we have Abu Dhabi Dialogue, Colombo Process, the ASEAN, as a forum to discuss this as Asians, no? We have common things as Asian people. Maybe we should also inject a high degree of solidarity in the case of looking to migrant workers, again, particularly to those in precarious job situation and earning very low wages. So I stop there. Thank you.
Elaine, thank you. Thank you very much for those very extensive reflections, I think touching on some very important things, solidarity and looking outside of the box. Mr. Lachman.
Thank you. I would like to answer your first question between EU and Asian countries. There are some reciprocity between Belgium and other countries in Asia, South Asia. That in equality basis, you pay my worker working in your country, I pay your worker working in your working in my country. So that kind of reciprocation in equality basis. But the thing is, not many migrant workers are working in those countries at present, at this situation. So what we want, like I agree with Alan, that one is paying lump sum when your job is finished. That's not Social Security. That's you are keeping their money and you are paying them when they go back. What we want is social protection for lifelong. So that cannot be started by the country of origin, destination. Sorry, country of destination. That has to be started from the country of origin, because somehow or other they will come back to the country of origin, because no country will take the kind of worker I am talking about is low skill, is working in a very low jobs and working in a very precarious work in a very temporarily. So they have to come back here. So we are talking about those kind of people. Otherwise, those who are in the higher strata of job level, they are welcome. They settle in US, they settle in Canada, they settle in higher countries in most developed countries in Europe, and they don't try to come back. And they are much more migrated to that country. They don't need any kind of protection there. But what we are talking about, the protection, is those who come back, or those who are in a precarious situation, even at the job in the country of destination. We want security for them, somehow security for them. We have to find a very practical way that their life can be changed, not come back to countries of origin and suffer rest of their life. This is what I am trying to plead. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think an absolute important point, and we got a very clear demonstration of what that looks like with COVID. While COVID, so COVID traveled around to each corner of the globe, that also meant that the economic impacts, shrank the workspaces, it shrank the job opportunities, and also shrank the amount of labor supply that the economies could take for a couple of years. And we saw the impact of the returns of migrant workers. And so I think your point, Mr. Lachman, in terms of social protection and even social security, coming and returning home, starting at home, is a very important one, particularly for this group of migrant workers who are most likely to return and may not become, for instance, part of the diaspora in their particular country. So they don't have the means or have to, they don't have that opportunity to be able to stay on in those countries of destination. And one also wonders, with the numbers that we're seeing now, Europe is in crisis in terms of healthcare workers. There's calls for healthcare professionals to join, but actually these calls in most cases are temporal. So they're providing temporal work. It's not long life work, and that means that somehow what are the social protection related issues? What are the safety nets for migrant workers here? So as countries are also, and private agents are also gathering lists to send nurses, doctors, what does that look like in terms of social protection? And I think these are quite important points. A question that Cecily has raised, and I know we're conscious of the time, is, she's raised a question around, are all social security programs or safety nets designed for regularized migrants? And indeed, we have been talking a lot about, migrant workers in a more general way. I think Dr. Kennedy did touch on, irregular migrants, or at least sectors targeting, places where irregular migrants may come. So, for instance, in the informal sector that you see predominantly on the African continent, where migrants would be engaged in informal work if they are coming irregularly. But I think that's an important answer for question rather for our panelists as we would take a tour of the tablet. I think I read one more comment from the floor. Thanks, Elaine. We can also hear your reflection shared in that. Dr. Raj, thank you for your comments, and I'll just read it out. Unless you are okay to come on and share with us a minute's reflection, Dr. Raj. Okay, and Dr. Raj says that we need
scribble something. What I was trying to say was that, and Lakshman is right, that it is actually what we're talking about is workers who are on contract service. So that means they are not settled permanently. And those who are settled permanently, portability will be important because they might want to come back to their home country after they have worked abroad. So these two issues are very different. Now, as regards what can be, I'll be very quick, as regards contract workers or short-term or temporary workers abroad, I was wondering if there's a way of having some kind of national insurance system where they contribute regardless of where they are, so they should be able to access at least state pension. There are two kinds of benefits: state, contributory. Contributory, where you pay something, employer pays something. But if you're on a temporary basis, you're better off with your end of service gratuity, so you can invest and so on. Now, these are very practical issues we all face, whether migrants or regular workers for that matter. So I think these are, so how are the countries of origin thinking about this? Because in my mind, this thing of old age social security and so on, is very much socially and culturally constructed. And in many developing countries, the thought in the mind of the people that I will have to contribute to my own welfare is not there yet. I may be wrong, especially at the low level. So this thing of, do I need to secure my old age? No, my child or my son, my daughter will take care of me. There's that much. So there's a lot of sensitization need to be done. And Ghana's thing of ensuring informal or self-employed people through a government scheme where they contribute. The government doesn't contribute, but you as a worker contribute. So there are lots of these bits and pieces floating around. So I think in a particular situation, one may need to reflect how to avail of some of the options that are there and how to work on that, optimize, maximize in the interest of the welfare of especially workers abroad. Thanks very much. Thank you. Sorry, I just babbled. But
no, that's good. That's good, Dr. Raj. Thank you. I think those reflections are absolutely timely. As we do, maybe I'll ask for some reflections to be shared. So we do a 2-minute each from each of our speakers. Can we start with Dr. Kennedy? Kennedy, the floor is yours. We just need you to unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to start from Dr. Raj's last point. The fact that what is being done at the countries of origin, like national insurance scheme for people to contribute to, I think that is very key, because we are looking at the long-term benefits, social security, the compulsory national schemes, old age, survivors benefit, which can be difficult in terms of their parliaments ratifying and reviewing the laws. But the low-hanging fruits are there, schemes are there, social assistance, other benefits. because we know that migrants sometimes are in precarious conditions and are temporary. So there are those innovative schemes around. If they have information, they can avail themselves to qualify, to access and support themselves. So we need to be mindful of those things before we are talking about the long-term benefits, which can be difficult in terms of the laws being reformed and the processes involved to create that window for migrants. But let me say that if you look at the case of Ghana, I think he partly touched on it. The two first years, he stated it must be workers that are employed in an organization in Ghana. And then if you are even outside, you would have been under an organization based in Ghana that has employed you. But of course, the third window created opportunity for people, not employed by somebody, but voluntarily I can contribute to that scheme. And of course, it also allows the diaspora and migrants outside, wherever they are, to contribute to the third tier, which is in a way an innovation to having access to this. So I think these are some of the things we need to look at. Of course, we are designing a diaspora engagement policy with issues of social security tied in and other areas of investment to look at how they contribute to the economy and, of course, contribute to themselves if they have to return home and the families that they've left behind. Some of the facts, as we said, I would say that civil society and other key stakeholders must be involved. We have had an arrangement with Barbados where we will have to export nurses. As I talk to you, I'm not privy to the agreement or that agreement. How can we advocate for improvement when you don't have access to the arrangement with Barbados, between Ghana and Barbados? These are some of the things we need to look at. But of course, the systems must be reformed, innovative and inclusive approaches to getting migrants that are in precarious conditions to have access to some social protection. And then we can talk of the national social security schemes covering them. These are some of the things we need to look at in our aspect. And then going into arrangements with other countries, we need to be very cautious in terms of including protective clauses, particularly with regards to social security clauses, protect our brothers and sisters that would move out to work over there and then have some cushion.
Thank you. Thank you, Kennedy. Thank you for sharing that. Mr. Lachman.
Thank you. I want to conclude with one story of my personal story. I went to the United States in 1969 as a student there. I got a Social Security number, which I still remember. I worked there for 3.5 years in 3 cities. Minneapolis, I started with Minneapolis, Minnesota. Then I went to Chicago. I went to university there. Then I moved to Washington, D.C. and stayed 3.5 years. That's 1969. I didn't care about the social, I did not know, but I had a card. So my employer was paying for me all the time, from my salary, Generally, employer doesn't pay his salary. If the government takes it out from the business taxes. So that was about, I stayed there 3.5 years. What we are looking for now, I was not a migrant status or green card holder. I was a student. Then I returned back to my country. In 2011, I went to Mexico for a COP meeting. And then I went to New Mexico, Gallup there. And a friend of mine took me to the Social Security because I saw a friend of mine, he was getting some money from his Social Security in my country, from United States. So I went to the Social Security office in New Mexico, one of the city in New Mexico, and I asked, how much is my Social Security you owe me? So the lady in the counter asked me, "What's your name?" And I said, "My name is Lakshman Basnet." So she typed my name in computer, but she could not find my name. No, we don't have your record. Because I took my social security card from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Then I stayed in work in Chicago, then Washington, and I'm looking for my social security benefit in New Mexico. That's the fourth city after 30 or 40 years. 40 years. Never short for that. And I told her my number, which was on my head somehow or other, and she printed, typed that number in the computer. And that whole my social security number came out, everything. And she told me, "Mr. Basnet, you have to work 25 more quarters here. You have worked 15 quarters only, so you have to work 25 more quarters. Then you will get social security benefit. That is, you have in the United States to get social security, you have to work 10 years. 10 years, that's 40 quarters. 10 years is 40 quarters you have to work. Then you get a certain amount, that's the minimum amount of social security, whether you are a national or foreigner or migrant workers, precarious, anything, you get social security wherever you stay. You will get that. This is what we are looking for, social security benefit. I don't know who is going to provide it, but that is because from South Asia, most of the workers, and even from Africa, they are going all precarious jobs, doing precarious jobs, not much education, not much skills, training, but they acquire education and training in that country. We don't know whether they will get their status in that country or not, but Social Security should follow them whenever, wherever they go, like a mobile number or WhatsApp number or Viber number. You don't need anything. All you need is internet and a telephone number and your name, and the Social Security follow you wherever you go. This is what migrant workers in this world, this present situation, the world is like that. My union guy was working in Kuwait. Then he was in Dubai. Then I met him in Qatar. And he said, because he was my union member in Nepal. I know him for last 30 years. So he said, "How long do you want to work?" "Sir, I will work 5-6 more years, and then I'll go back home because my social security will give, up till now, it has given me education for my children. Now he worked around 7 years or 8 years in GCC countries. I am working in Qatar in a good place in a hotel because he was a hotelier, and I take that money and build a house and start working. Now he is a general manager. He was a boss boy in Nepal. Then he went to GCC country. Coming back, now he is a sort of a food and beverage manager in a 5-star hotel. With whatever he has earned, he has made a good life for him, for education and everything, and upgraded himself also. This is what we are looking for. This is my personal opinion. You may just contest it also. Thank you very much.
That's such a delight to hear, the intent that you have and the intent that I think most would also subscribe to. The fact that you have a social security that works for you, no matter how many years it has been, and no matter how far, because it's a contribution. It's an important recognition of the contribution that workers do. And also it's taken from workers' contributions. So, why are you, as Mr. Lane had started, if migrants are moving, why is the Social Security not following them? Mr. Lane, reflections from your side.
Yeah, so thank you, Paddy. And this is a good forum to discuss Social Security, which is part of the elements of decent work. And well, the other one, social dialogue, is also very elusive in for migrant workers, but more so as well social security and social protection. And as of course, we recognize that there have been positive developments in the last few years, even in the Gulf, in the last Abu Dhabi dialogue last year. some of the countries were saying that they have started, and this is of course based on the pandemic experience, they would be requiring employers to enroll their workers in private insurance, for, but not for the pension, not of the pension nature, but again, for the here and now. So increasingly there is that. There is also mandatory enrollment to medical insurance, health and medical insurance, or medical cards for employers. No, this is also a requirement in many countries of destination in Asia. And perhaps that is understandable in the sense that they would not want the migrant workers to be their public charge or something like, okay, we will be responsible for you. So instead of them, they are passing it on to the private sector by insuring them in private insurance schemes, which is still a welcome development considering taking off from none. Yeah, but again, I think in the long term, the challenge really is how do you provide as well for the time when they have to retire. And the argument, of course, by nature, migrant workers are mobile. They move from one country to another. They follow where the work is. And it cannot be always the reason why they will be excluded from the Social Security program of countries. So I think one important aspect of Social Security and social protection that must be injected in the context of migrant workers is the totalization, that wherever they go, they might need to contribute, but then they bring this contribution wherever they go. So that's why the portability as well. So maybe in the present scheme of things, because of course the priority is always like with workers within borders, these are like issues that they have to contend with, because of course a lot of these schemes are reflected in laws. So you may need to change the laws and harmonize the laws because it entails, it involves several countries and not only one social security scheme. You need to make it more coherent and you need to harmonize, and this takes time. But then I think it is not impossible. So maybe the profile of migrant workers in Europe, in Canada, in the US is different from what we have here in Asia. But I think the example of Japan, I don't know yet how it is being applied, the Social Security Agreement to Japan, but at least there is already that one country in Asia that has agreed to forge Social Security agreement with countries of the origin, no? So it's not like, because of course the fear is if we forge with one, then maybe everybody will follow suit. But I mean, yeah, and that's why many countries of origin are compelled to do it bilaterally. Of course, the better way to go about these things, especially because we have a lot of common things with the other migrants in the region, is yeah, let's negotiate, for example, with one country of origin. But again, there's always that idea that, oh, you negotiate with one, negotiate with all. But I mean, again, the reality is labor migration is a phenomenon because there is imbalance in terms of the workers. You know, you need workers in one country and you have a lot of workers in another country, then they go. They have these exchanges. So I think at the end of the day, let's try to push for more long-term protection, but also when there is public emergency or pandemic such as this one, let's not exclude the migrants. Again, SDG hashtag, no one should be left behind. And I think let's try to like really make it concrete in the case of migrant workers, and particularly women migrant workers who are disproportionately impacted because of the nature of their work, the concentration of jobs that they are in, but also migrant workers in general, you know, so that they don't go home empty-handed, you know, and sick and with disability, and they cannot anymore function 100%, you know, if they have acquired the disabilities in the process of their migration journey. So I think let's try to make use of the spaces available for the GCM. 2022 is the first reckoning. So let's just keep on pushing back. You know, not only destination countries for sure, but origin countries as well, no? And yeah, addressing drivers of migration from the origin country can also go a long way. So maybe that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much on ending us on that high, but also realization of the tasks that we have at hand. I think we have had an excellent opportunity, for us to dive into many issues. One of the last comments that we received in the chat there from Dina was, talking to us about, ensuring that you have a balance between countries of origin and countries of destination. And indeed, shared responsibility is also important. And also understanding that migrants have agency. I think, bringing them back into that conversation, something that Kennedy also picked up a lot in talking about, civil society organizations, but even there, realizing that there is the diversity within civil society, realizing that there's diversity within migrant workers, the diversity that's there, as migrant workers move to better their livelihoods, they join various sectors, some formal, but we also have a lot that are joining the what would be defined as the informal sector. So how does legislation cover that? But I think we've also been challenged to say that even when legislation doesn't provide the means, how do we see the low-hanging fruits, borrowing from Dr. Kennedy's words, and instead, press on innovation in spaces where, we can still take action while we're waiting for legislative reform. I think we've also been challenged in terms of the high degree of solidarity and looking outside of the box, both for countries of origin, but also countries of destination. And I think this also speaks very much to different schemes and products, I think, that have been outlined. The best practices seem to be plenty, so we are not out of tools from the toolbox. We're also not out of experts. We're also not out of frameworks. What we need more is the commitment for us to drive through the intent and the ambitions that we've set before us. The political willingness. A lot of the speakers have also pointed to this. Looking back, I think, into the past, and Mr. Lachman also took us also on a very personal journey to see how systems that have worked in the past, how do we model them today to, and leverage on things like technology that we have, and the fact that we have populations that are mobile and that migrant workers will indeed be mobile, and therefore really chimming back into what the objective looks intends, or the objective, positions states to commit to ensuring that portability of earned social benefits. And it's important, actually, I was looking at, when I looked at the text, that it doesn't say that, your social security entitlements and they're just benefits. That migrant workers have actually earned these benefits. And why, with all the technology that we have in the world today, why are those not being portable back to their countries of origin? I think the role of countries of origin has been emphasized, something that seems to be lacking in terms of emphasis in the GCM. We also are all aware that the month of May, and actually the last couple of months, and this year, 2022, is an important year in terms of reflecting on the Global Compact for Migration. How do we center it back to be on the course that will contribute to some of the issues that we have talked about today? How do we center back GCM 22 on social protection so that it serves the migrants and is not serving other purposes? So I think it has been a very engaging discussion. It's difficult to bring out all the important issues that have been deliberated and shared by our excellent panel. And so at this point in juncture, let me say thank you very much to Ellen Sana, Executive Director for Center for Migrant Advocacy in the Philippines, Dr. Kennedy Akachoma, who is the labor economist and principal of the Ghana Labor College of Trades Union Congress, Mr. Lachman Basnet, the General Secretary of South Asian Regional Trade Union Council. You have been an excellent panel to learn from. You have inspired us. And I see a hello there that comes from Professor Binod. I don't know how I didn't spot you, Professor Binod, today, but glad to see that you were here with us today. And with that, to our able panelists, hello, Professor Binod, thank you for joining us. With that, you're on mute, Professor Binod.
I have benefited a lot. I think, yeah, more than than anybody can say. Together, it has been a collective wisdom that I have benefited from, and I congratulate all the speakers for bringing out such important issues involved. And there is a lot that we still need to do in this particular context. Perhaps we can continue that dialogue later on. Thanks for your contribution, Patty.
Thank you very much, Professor Binod. And it's good to see Ms. Grace in the Philippines. Ms. Dina, nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope that the women in the house here and those that are in your homes and elsewhere have enjoyed this International Women's, we're calling it International Women's Week because apparently they say that we should have actually had a week instead of a day. So a happy Women's International Week for those who are still celebrating, and a good day to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us.
Good night.
Just an announcement with regards to GCM 2023. So not the last one of the webinars, but the last of the GCM. We will host this next week on Thursday. So there is no webinar on Tuesday next week, but we're having it on Thursday. So we're glad that you're able to, if you'll be able to join us. And again, the same time, 1 p.m. if you can note it. With that, we have come to the end of our webinar. And I'll ask the colleagues if we could pause for the recording, but I do understand that we have students in the room who have some questions regarding an assignment, but we should let our guests, Mr. Lachman, thank you again for joining us today. Elaine, Dr. Kennedy, thank you for being with us. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. It was a great pleasure. Nice.
Thank you.